All right, thank you all for joining. I will now introduce today's presenter. So Ken Easterday received his Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Colorado in 1979. And after graduation, he began working as a staff pharmacist at University Hospital at 9th and Colorado Boulevard in Denver, Colorado. He began his service with the Colorado Multiple Institutional Review Board in 1991 and also began coordinating the inpatient investigational drug service at University Hospital. In April of 1999, he was appointed as co-chair in COMIRB and soon thereafter experienced the federal shutdown of human subject research in September of 1999. Ken retired from UC Health in 2014 and continues to serve COMIRB as co-chair of Panel A. Thank you, Ken, for being here with us today, and I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Tim, does the screen look okay?
Looks great.
Great. I'm wearing the same color shirt, but I'm not going to hold my head like this for the whole presentation. So this day in COMIRB history, it was kind of tough. That's 26 years and 4 days ago. Probably not too many people may remember what they were doing on that day, but I certainly do. It was a real crazy time, and I've tried to go back through some of the files and documents that I have in putting this presentation together to really try to give you the perspective of what it felt like. So for the agenda today, what I'd like to talk about is early University of Colorado Health Sciences Center, as we were known then, human subject oversight. The image on the right here is the bridge over 9th and Colorado Boulevard, over 9th Street, just east of Colorado Boulevard. University Hospital would have been on the left and the medical campus on the right. That area no longer exists. It's been completely redeveloped. I'll talk about the regulatory environment in the late 1990s. Because in looking back, there were some storm clouds on the horizon. So COMIRB had FDA audits in 1997 and 1999. I don't have the 483 forms from those audits, but I've been able to piece together, I think, a pretty good picture of what was happening or what the results of that audit were. So on September 13th, 1999, the FDA generated their warning letter with the administrative restrictions. We'll talk about that letter and specifically the things that they cited. Of course, this was a crisis. Talk about a response and a recovery and how long that took. And I found a nice Chinese proverb that I think summarizes the crisis at the time. And that is, a crisis is an opportunity riding a dangerous wind. I'll include some Denver Post comments. This is quite extensively covered in both the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News. Of course, the Rocky Mountain News doesn't exist anymore, so I wasn't able to access any archival material there. And I'd like to hear maybe audience experiences. If you happen to be on campus and experience the shutdown, in looking through the names of attendees, I think there certainly are some individuals that helped in the recovery process and then later joined or had affiliations with COMIRB. So it'd be great to hear comments from everybody. So I started in 1991 at the University of Colorado Human Subject Committee. In 1992, it was reformulated into the Colorado Multiple Institutional Review Board, or COMIRB. And I think it's a rather unique concept, different from other IRBs, where we're responsible for multiple institutions. And I've listed them there. So in the 1998 era, COMIRB had about 3,200 protocols. Funding was for research about $190 million a year. $40 million of that was government funding. The COMIRB office consisted of a staff of 1.5 FTE. The office space is probably smaller than my current living room, and that space had to house 3,200 protocols worth of paper records and office space. So we were very limited in a space resource. The board at the time consisted of 40 members. Quorum requirement was 21 members because the federal regulations say that you have to have half of your membership there plus one member. The chair was responsible for taking minutes of the meeting, which you can probably imagine were quite minimal at the time. We were very deficient in documenting voting or conflict of interest. And voting was generally by consensus. You're either all in or all out. Information management of the time, like I said, was primarily paper. There was a fairly rudimentary tracking database that was in place. So in 1999, I was asked to be a co-chair early in the year. I needed to talk to my director of pharmacy, to get their approval to be able to do this. And I very distinctly remember asking John Moorhead about how many hours a week would I need to commit to COMIRB. And he said that it would just take about 2 hours. So little did I know later in the year that this would very dramatically change. So the image on the right is the Biomedical Research Building at 9th and Colorado Boulevard. We had board meetings on the 8th floor, where the big windows are, great view looking out to the west. You might be interested, what's the dust or smoke? That was the day it was demolished. So what was the environment like at the time? So the Office of Inspector General released a report entitled Institutional Review Boards, A Time for Reform. And this was June of 1998. So the summary findings from that report indicated that there had been major changes in the research environment. So the current framework for IRB practices was shaped in a 1970s environment, where research was carried out by a single investigator, generally working under government funding, with a small cohort of human subjects in a university teaching hospital. And in recent years, that was rapidly changing, because there was a proliferation of multi-site trials, new types of research and research designs, an increased number of research protocols. So the workload was increasing dramatically, which resulted in IRBs reviewing too much, too quick, with too little expertise. So we had expanded workloads, resource constraints, and also extensive federal mandates, which all contributed to a very rushed atmosphere where sufficient deliberation was often not possible. And then if you go back to my comment about chairs taking notes, too little time for deliberation, too little documentation of what that discussion was. So IRBs conducted minimal continuing review. We had too little information about how the informed consent process was really working, as well as how well the interests of the subjects were being protected during the course of the research. There were conflicts that threatened the IRB independence. Institutions expected IRBs to support their interests at the same time they protected human subjects. There was little training for investigators and board members. I think at that time we didn't have annual training documented, and I certainly remember beginning as a co-chair. I just mentored with Alan Prochaska for a bit, and I was good to go. And there's no evaluation of the effectiveness of IRBs. So we really didn't know how well we were accomplishing our mission. So the recommendations from this report, and I'd like to read them to you. With the above findings, we do not claim that there are widespread abuses of human research subjects. The current system of protections is supported by many conscientious research investigators committed to protecting human subjects, and by many dedicated IRB members and staff doing their best under trying circumstances. A review of the system cannot help but be impressed by the contributions of these individuals and the important functions that IRBs have fulfilled over the past quarter century. Now, here comes the important part. But our findings present an important warning signal. The capacity of IRBs to accomplish all that is expected of them is strained. In the years ahead, this difficult situation could become even worse in view of federal plans to increase significantly the number of subjects in clinical trials and various proposals to give IRBs added responsibilities in the areas of genetics and confidentiality. It is time, we believe, for reform. So the Office of Protections from Research Risks, or OPRR, was created in 1972 and was under the NIH. Later, they would move in 2020 to the Department of Health and Human Services and be rebranded as OHRP. So I can imagine federal officials were thinking, well, how do we drive reform? We could try collaboratively to work with IRBs to have reform. Look at the FDA. We were audited in 1997 and 1999. Not much happened in between, as you'll soon find out. So I think they really felt the best way to drive reform was to create that crisis or that dangerous wind. And how did that happen? So in the late 90s, there was a series of widely publicized compliance actions. Large, prestigious academic research institution had temporary suspensions. I've listed some of them there, and that got the attention of the research community. So you can bet, in addition to those institutions and COMIRB, everyone else was looking at their IRB systems. So let's talk about the FDA inspection that we had between February and March 1st of 1997. So specific violations at that time cited was that continuing reviews of studies was found to be severely inadequate. And we actually had 758 studies that were overdue for continuing review. And the regulations require continuing review annually for greater than minimal risk studies. Or if the board determines that there's more serious risk that require more frequently monitoring, they can request that. So there was a lack of written procedures for conducting continuing review and determining which projects did require more frequent review other than annually. There was no mechanism to track studies that required review more often than annually. So we had a couple years to fix that, right? And I wasn't a part of those fixes or the discussion of how we do fix these things, but I think the thought was we've got it fixed. So in between April 5th and 15th of 1999, there was a follow-up FDA audit. And that resulted in the warning letter that was dated September 13th of 1999. We'll talk about the specific concerns in just a moment. But the main issue of this was there were administrative restrictions placed on us. The seriousness of these deviations requires that the FDA implement administrative action to ensure compliance with regulations governing IRBs. So no new studies that were subject to the FDA regulations were to be approved by your IRB. No new subjects were to be admitted to ongoing studies until we had notified FDA or FDA has notified us that adequate corrections have been made. So what did the FDA find? Failure to conduct adequate continuing review of research. Same theme as from 1997. Employees have not been fully trained on the use of the database. The database and paper files were compared for accuracy, and there were many examples noted where files and the database contained errors that affected adequate continuing review. So we really didn't do any quality assurance between the two systems. The review of continuing review reports is inadequate to address enrollment discrepancies. And this is probably the biggest one, is that records do not indicate that adverse events were reviewed by the IRB. Item 2, failure to prepare and follow detailed SOPs, standard operating procedures, for conducting the review of research. And that included periodic review. So complete SOPs for the use and maintenance of the database have not been written. Completion of attendance sheets for meetings is not described in SOPs. Records indicate that procedures for continuing review remain inadequate and did not address how staff are to review and resolve discrepancies when deviations are found. And the federal regs required that if an IRB suspend or terminate a study, that the FDA and OHRP is notified. So termination of approval is not addressed in SOPs, and the procedures for following the suspension and termination were not described. Studies were reinstated without consistent criteria or SOPs for reinstatement. And SOPs have not been developed to require that termination status of studies and the reason for termination even be entered into the database. So number 3, failure to follow written procedures for ensuring the prompt reporting of any suspension or termination of IRB approval. And we didn't have SOPs and we didn't know how to do it. In fact, it was stated that COMIRB personnel were under the impression that they only needed to notify the FDA of termination if there was a safety issue. Failure to prepare and maintain adequate documentation of IRB activities, including continuing review. So the new COMIRB database, which is utilized by COMIRB to identify studies requiring continuing review, has never been audited against actual files to assure accuracy. Studies were identified during the inspection that do not appear in the database. Meeting minutes include undated handwritten entries, which are non-initials and do not elaborate on the serious issues discussed during the meetings. There was a lack of documentation that members with conflict of interest abstained from initial or continuing review of their studies. And a study that required full committee review appeared to have underwent expedited review because the primary reviewer was not present. So we had the FDA with their administrative restrictions, and very shortly after, OPRR on September 22nd broadened those restrictions to include all federally funded studies. And they went further to say that subjects could not participate in the study that they were currently in unless doing so would jeopardize their health and safety. So we had the FDA shutting down drug studies. We had OPRR shutting down federally funded studies. CU voluntarily suspended all research studies. It wouldn't have been ethical to continue with studies that did not fit those parameters. So again, this was a crisis, and how did we respond? And what did that workload and what did that experience look and feel like? So both the FDA and OPRR allowed subjects that would suffer harm to health and or safety to continue participation. So we required a letter from a PI requesting a waiver for continued participation in those studies affected. So there was a lot of energy initially, reviewing and approving those waivers. And as of October 31st, we had done 500 waivers. So process reengineering. I think there were multiple consultants hired to help. One that the Denver Post describes quite well is hiring Dr. Cynthia McGuire-Dunn. She's the director of research at the time at the University of Rochester in Minnesota. Their institution experienced a similar shutdown in 1995, so she had experience recovering from this. In fact, it took about 1.5 years with half the number of protocols for them to fully recover. So there was assistance revising and developing all these missing and deficient standard operating procedures for all activities. We revised submission documents and informed consent templates and developed instructions for clinical investigators. So at the time, we were all paper. This is a very paper-intensive process. So the image on the right describes how to create a packet to submit to the IRB for a new review or a re-review. There was the application, the protocol, amendments, the summary, the investigator brochure, the current consent form, the new consent form to meet our new standards, medical licenses, all the past SAEs, safety reports, the federal grant, site-specific forms, advertisements. I remember to go into meetings and you would almost need one of those portable roller carts to bring the paper to the meeting. we revised our review panels. So obviously with one very large panel, we weren't going to have much throughput to administer our corrective action. So we increased the panels from 1 to 3 with the goal of also establishing a 4th panel in January of 2000. So to do that, we had to recruit additional chairs. We also had to recruit new members. We had 9 members per panel, so we were much smaller than our large one-panel 40-member group. And with 9 per panel, it took 5 to achieve quorum and begin reviews. But for all 3, that was 27 members. And then, of course, they couldn't go to all the meetings, so we had to have some alternates as well. So all in all, recruiting additional chairs and up to 47 panel members. So extensive revision to our review process. Develop new documents, checklists, attendance sheets, voting, and conflict of interest documentation. Remember, those were the deficiencies cited. Prior to that time, there was no pre-review of materials before they went to a meeting. So implemented a system of pre-review, making sure everything looked as good as possible before it went to a meeting. And then documentation of review procedures at meetings. And then new procedures for taking minutes. So added staff members to actually record and generate minutes. So there was a huge commitment of resources to establishing new panels, new staff to support those panels and maintain minutes and do pre-review. Next was training. There was COMIRB 101, and this was mandatory for investigators and research staff. There was also a mandatory COMIRB 201, which was a self-study program. Develop monthly seminar series for researchers, COMIRB members, and staff. For all of our new IRB members, we had IRB 101. The faculty is described at the right. And then, of course, all this had to be documented and tracked. And before panel members could do reviews, before investigators could submit protocols, training had to be documented. So as part of the corrective action plans, we received approval from the FDA to contract with Western IRB in Seattle, Washington, to review up to 600 studies that were FDA regulated. And I don't know how many in the Cancer Center would have been fallen under the WERB arm of review. The goal of that was to allow FDA regulated studies to more quickly resume. And of course, that also took a significant, probably financial commitment of resources. So the plan was after WERB reviewed its first 20% of the studies of these 600, a progress report would be sent to the FDA, and the FDA would determine if the review process was adequate. So concurrent with WERB doing reviews, we were required to concurrently review 9 protocols, 3 per panel, and then submit documentation of our review to the FDA. So what the FDA was looking for is consistency between WERB and us. So concurrent review by COMIRB occurred on November 4th, and Western IRB, the 20% milestone was completed on December 9th. So part of the corrective action plan was to re-review all research protocols, 3,200 of them. I think I missed a slide. Let me go back. No, we're good. So we developed new SOPs, new documentation, new processes. We had minute takers. The first step was to beta test the process, see how it worked. And the goal of that was to fine tune if we needed to make changes. We didn't want to jump completely all in and then have to change things and restart. So in October, investigators were requested to prioritize protocols for re-review. And in November, up to 300 studies were closed. So that taking away the dead wood that we didn't have to re-review was a huge help. In March of 2000, any protocols that were still outstanding, we asked that they be submitted for re-review by May 15th, or the IRB would close them. So what was progress like? My records are a little bit skimpy, but they start in February of 2000, and they start with 328 protocols approved. So once we got approval by the FDA to begin re-reviewing, that's all the throughput we had was 328. So per the line there, you can tell it was a really long and hard slog because September, October of 2000, it was about a year after our shutdown, we were at about 1,200. So information management. Hey, we all survived Y2K. That would have been a catastrophe if the brand new database and everything else went away due to Y2K. An interim database had been developed. Staff training on the database by the developer was done. We developed a website for communication and instruction. And it's hard to think back, 1999, email just wasn't quite as ubiquitous like it is today. So communication was a challenge. So important final milestones. So on October 6th, CU sent the initial corrective action plan to the FDA, and there was some back and forth there. On November 4th, the FDA allowed studies to resume once they had been reviewed again under the strict new guidelines. December 23rd, our Christmas gift was the FDA approved CU to resume research studies in its FDA-regulated non-funded trials. So that was about 101 days. That was an incredible amount of work that took place during that time period. In my records, I don't have when OPRR allowed us to fully resume work on federally funded research. I think it was likely very shortly after that. So it's interesting, and I included some Denver Post quotes because this is very extensively covered by the press and the television news. So September 24th, patients enrolled in studies should contact their doctor heading the study to find out whether their treatment or observation will continue. So imagine if we had, say, 3,200 studies, 10 subjects per studies. Research teams were getting up to 32,000 phone calls about, hey, what's going on with my participation? So there's a quote, the suspension could end as quickly as has happened at other institutions that faced similar shutdowns in the past year. We will respond to the federal officials beginning tomorrow, and we hope to have this resolved within 1 week. Well, 26 years of hindsight is pretty good. It obviously didn't take a week. We're very disappointed in the administration that this had to occur. I had to tell 3 patients about to enter a study that they couldn't. So the next day, your patients won't die and neither will your careers. Seems rather insensitive. CU officials think that they can satisfy the government by next Friday. This affects me, my career, my patients. There has been an enormous impact over the past 2 days. An FDA researcher told them in April not to worry, but then the FDA changed its expectations without warning. Hopefully, this will be resolved soon on October 7th. We have patients who are waiting to enroll in protocols, and if they can't enroll, they'll have standard treatment or they'll have to go elsewhere. The academic center's response will now be looked at favorably, and that they will lift their restrictions when they are satisfied that we have completely overhauled our process. We cannot predict when they will do so. So we went from getting it fixed in a week to predicting when that would occur. October 15th, re-reviewing more than 2,000 federally funded studies will take 3 to 4 months. From the chart we saw previously, it actually took about a year. We can't say it will take 6 weeks or 6 months until we know how many studies need to be re-reviewed. It was all of them. We're losing patients, we're losing science, we're losing things. People are appropriately worried and upset. There is no estimate of the ban's cost. And a little bit of frustration coming in on October 31st. Happy Halloween. Each week, it's potentially next week. The full effects of the suspension won't be known for a long time and involves hundreds of patients and millions of dollars. The cost of revamping the review process comes right out of our hides. This is really disruptive, is an understatement. How long can I continue to run my office? I don't want to lay off staff. They've been aware for a long time that there was insufficient staff for the COMIRB office. November 5th, Thursday. The FDA said studies can resume once they have been reviewed again under strict new guidelines. They've established a triage system to ensure the sickest and the most important studies that affect patients resume first. While there's a lot of work ahead, this is clearly a better place than where we were a week ago. The FDA is requiring monthly reports, and OPRR wants them quarterly. How long will it take to do reviews? The 3 boards met for the first time last week and managed to approve only 2 protocols under the new guidelines. Christmas Eve, Denver Post. We're pleased that the FDA has rescinded the restrictions and FDA regulated research on human subjects. We're committed as an institution to the highest standards of patient care and research compliance. From early on, we knew it would be a one step at a time thing. With their lifting of it, it gets us much closer to getting everything going again. So reflecting back on the shutdown experience 26 years ago, it was a time of incredible pressure, stress, and anxiety. While the immediate goal was to satisfy regulatory requirements, the university's response ultimately resulted in the Human Research Protection Program that is in place today, where together we can make tomorrow's research happen. I'm grateful that I had the privilege of contributing to COMIRB, and I thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Ken. That was a really great presentation. So I know we do have a couple of folks who would like to share their experiences, and we also did have one question that was submitted ahead of time. So I'll ask that question first. Um, so what would you say has been the hardest or most challenging thing in general of working with COMIRB over the years?
Of course, the shutdown, I mean, I'll answer that right away.
Yeah,
But I will say it's almost the more you know, the more you the more you know you don't know. I mean, every single day it seems like there's something new, there's something unique, there's a new design, a new issue, a new question that you haven't experienced before. So it really is a good challenge.
great, great. Um, and I just had one more question that just got posed to me. So, what actions would you recommend departments proactively implement to address and prevent these types of shortfalls and avoid like this amount of work to fix it?
Well, I think the institutional support for our human subject research protection program is amazing. I mean, I look back at what we had and what we are, and there's so much support from the institution in place, um, that there's resources. If anyone needs help, and I would like to say, I think COMIRB is extremely collaborative. I mean, we're very open to working with investigators and study teams. And again, we're not just looking to satisfy regulatory requirements, but our goal is human subject protection. And that really is our focus.
Great.
But as far as what departments can do, I mean, look at the website. I mean, we're constantly, updating checklists and giving guidance on how to do submissions. COMIRB office hours. Be proactive. Talk to COMIRB first if you have a question about your study design. And of course, there's going back all those little details about making sure your training is up to date, and obviously reading the minutes that you get with feedback from us. It's surprising how many times later it's like, did they even read the minutes that we returned? So
Yeah,
lots of little things.
great. Good. Okay, so I think my colleague Victoria is going to share an anecdote from someone as well.
Yeah, hi Ken. Thank you so much for presenting with us this afternoon. Tim and I had reached out to just a couple of folks who have been at the university for quite some time. One of those being Mary Jackson, who works with our lung cancer prevention team as a retiree. So Mary granted me permission to share her experience with the group. And so relating to the resubmission process that you described. So Mary wrote to me, I was affiliated with the university at that time and do remember that experience. Mary remembers that all trials were shut down and every research protocol had to be resubmitted for COMIRB. As part of the clinical trials team with the most experience at the university, she and her team had to work with COMIRB in the organizing of all protocols that were submitted. She made a note that those were paper only at the time. And so as you can imagine, that was a very large process. Um, Mary was working as a CRC at the time with no experience in the IRB, and what was also handed the responsibility of submitting all of our SPORE protocols. So that was her initiation into regulatory. And now Mary is assisting with the regulatory work, again, with our LCP team as a retiree. So just wanted to share that little anecdote. I also know Katie Hogan was here at that time and had some experiences that she'd be willing to share as well.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. And yes, I was here at that time. I was actually working in the dean's office and joined the COMIRB team 3 days after the shutdown. So those that knew John Moorhead would know he didn't mince words. He was very direct in how he talked, and he came over to my desk and asked if I would help out. And I said yes. And he leaned into the person's office that I was reporting to at that time and said, I'm taking her. And I picked up my stuff and I went on the other side of the wall. So on the other side of the wall, as Ken explained, right, we had to re-review these protocols. And so we physically were taking files out of the file cabinets and stacking them on the desk. We stacked them so high that you couldn't see any of the staff over the protocols. So you remember they were these big blue folders and they were just stacked tight with papers. And just to kind of speak to a little bit of the environment, we definitely were in a crisis, right? It was a reactive state. We really kind of had no idea what we were doing, to be honest. So we were trying to learn as we went along, and we were in, the dean's office on 9th and Colorado, and the phones just rang off the hook, and people lined up to, they all had questions and wanted their time. They were anxious, as you can imagine. So the staff, we actually were relocated to a hidden room in 9th and Colorado where we couldn't be contacted, so that we could get through and set up what needed to be done. So as we developed, as Ken said, SOPs and roles, and we were expanding. We were one of the first teams over at Fitzsimmons. And so we moved into offices that they quickly laid down carpet, and we all had hospital bathrooms in our offices. So it was just crazy times. And I actually wrote a lot of research papers on this in my grad program. So anyway, it was great to have you here today, Ken, and really appreciate you sharing all of this. So.
Thanks, Katie. Appreciate it. I was really hoping that an investigator who went through the shutdown would be here.
Yeah, so we have a little bit of time, so we can certainly open it up if there are any other questions or any other folks who are with us today have any experiences to share. I did receive uh, uh, an anonymous note, just somebody kind of like reconfirming a lot of the things that you talked about, Ken, that, some of the negative impacts of this, that, the reputation with the public was tainted, that patients, some patients were reluctant to agree to be in research. And it sounds like there was, in certain departments, there was conflict, there was inter-investigator conflict, that, those who were receiving federal funding maybe were in conflict with those who were receiving industry funding. So I can only imagine the kind of like wide-reaching impact that was felt. Um,
And I'm looking at chat. Bonnie, it sounds like you have something to share.
Yeah, I actually was an employee at the university in the late 80s and early 90s, subsequently left and was working in industry. And prior to this shutdown, so I was working with different biotech and pharma companies, but prior to this shutdown, DHHS had already shut down the University of California in 1998 and the University of Birmingham in Alabama. So just to put it at all in perspective, it wasn't like they picked on CU, right? It was sort of a systemic failure of IRBs, where they were looking at processes, and all of these IRBs were very large systems. The UC system was very large, and they all went through this as well. I was actually working on a heart transplant study with the university during this shutdown. And I remember walking in, I was a monitor, and I remember walking in and the coordinator handing me this letter that says, we're all shut down. And I'm like, ooh, this is a problem. Well, the PI who was on the FDA advisory board That was one of the studies where the existing patients could continue on the study because they were heart transplant subjects. It's not like you can just stop them, right? But they were restricted to not enroll any new subjects. So I can only speak to that one experience. I don't know, I wasn't internal to the university, I was external, but it was far-reaching, it was widespread, it was big news, and it was a lot of work. And I do remember, Ken, you mentioned the bringing in of WORB, and that was one of the big changes that I think came out of this, was the triaging of protocols that the university was going to sort of own and oversee. And then that by agreement with the university, that WORB was going to oversee, and COMIRB was going to cede their approval to WORB. And is that your recollection of that as well? That was one of the big changes, and that still exists today, correct? There are many old IRBs that are now working on camp, and that was not the case, correct me, in the 90s when this happened. There was COMIRB and nothing else, correct?
Initially, yes.
Yeah.
And part of the corrective actions, to get those FDA regulated studies up more quickly was to coordinate with WORB. And I don't know that financially how that went down. I think the goal was to have the study team have the sponsor pay for a WORB review, but if they refused, then the university would pay for that. So, and some of the comments, towards the end revolved around what did this cost the institution?
Right.
I have no idea, but the investment in additional staff, in support staff, the time period when we were shut down, I'm sure there was no federal or funding flowing for that. I imagine it was very substantial.
Yeah.
And I think to a degree that these very, very high profile shutdowns were probably pretty intentional on the part of the federal government to drive change that the OIGs, recommended in 1998.
Hi, Ken, it's Berlene. Good to see you again.
Hi,
Yeah,
Verlaine.
there was some university funding to the investigators. There wasn't much, and that did not, if you were industry, which is what we were really not eligible for those kinds of funds to kind of help some things going. But it was years of cost. We lost staff because, we were industry, and industry wouldn't even touch us for a couple of years. And so it was very long term for us as a research unit.
Hmm.
And it's, just going through these slides, you just can't know what it was like unless you were there. It was chaos, it was trauma. The buzz was so loud on campus that it would ring in your ears at night. And this went on for months and months and months. And I think that just it took us so long to recover that you probably couldn't even put a cost on it.
Berlene, this is Bonnie again. So in my world, which was industry, this was being repeated at the University of California campuses, and I had many studies that I was working on. And so what you're describing was repeated. It was intentional. It was, Ken, I think, a way to bring research into compliance in the United States, because and then I think out of this came the OHARP certifications, where IRBs and the FWA assurance numbers, I think that is something else that came out of this, but I don't know the history on those two things. but those
And
do exist, yeah.
if you look at our continuing reviews prior to the shutdown,
Mm.
COMIRB did not notify us. Our continuing reviews were something that we wrote on a piece of paper that said, we are requesting to continue our study for another year. That got submitted to the COMIRB, it got stamped, and that was our continuing review. So, I mean, that was literally it. And most of the time, Bonnie, it was your CRA that found that it needed a review rather than the COMIRB or even the investigator themselves.
Yeah,
So it is great to have something like this happen. At the time, it didn't feel like that, but certainly now, as we look back.
yeah, I do remember also subsequent to this, they shut down the University of Utah and they shut down Coast IRB.
Mhm. Rush.
So it wasn't, it became that IRBs would have more scrutiny and more accountability. And especially not only the university ones, but the for-profit ones. Because Schulman, Advera, WERB, Coast, there were a lot of private IRBs.
Well, Coast was eliminated.
Oh, yeah, I was there during that too. I saw that
There
in
was a sting
person.
operation on that IRB, so
Yeah.
from the
Yeah.
FDA.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Yep. So, I mean, I think that this kind of tells you or shows you that everybody's accountable, the PIs, the staff, the IRBs, the manufacturers, the sponsors.
Great. Well, thank
There's-
you all so much for the discussion. I know there were a couple of questions and anecdotes that we didn't have time to get to. It's 1 o'clock, so I just want to, once again say thank you so much to Ken and thank you everyone for coming. Please fill out the survey as you're exiting the meeting. I'm happy to. I'll keep the meeting open. I'll keep the Zoom running if folks want to continue the discussion for a little while longer. But thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you to our presenter.